Okay, hi everybody. Thanks so much for getting up early this morning to join us. I'm sure it wasn't easy, and I'm really grateful to you all for making the effort. And I'm also grateful to the organizers at South by Southwest for inviting me here today. Though I have to tell you that this invitation came as something of a surprise, because until today, the closest I'd ever been to this event was about 1,700 miles away. It was at Boston University, where I teach, and one of my students had emailed me to warn me that she was missing class to attend her grandmother's funeral in Yonkers, New York. So I sent the student my condolences, and I assumed that that would be that. But it wasn't, and I bet a lot of you can guess what happened. This student and I happen to be Facebook friends, and when I opened Facebook later that day, there she was, not in morning attire in Yonkers, but in party attire at South by Southwest. And she looked fabulous, and she looked like she was having a fabulous time. So some days later, I invited her into my office when she returned to Boston. After class, I invited her in my office, and I opened my Facebook page, and I asked her, had her grandmother risen from the dead to join her in Austin? And I thought that would just kind of shake her up, throw off her game, but it didn't. She looked me straight in the eye, and she said, "Well, that's not me. That's my twin sister." So forgive me for sharing that story, but I just had to. That's about as close as I've ever gotten, and about as close as I ever thought I'd be to South by Southwest. But here we are today, and I'm really delighted to be here, and I hope you guys have had as much fun as I have at this festival. But let's get back to the reason we're here, which is to talk about my book, The Job. Often, when I give these kinds of talks, I'm asked to begin by telling the story of what drew me to the subject at hand. That's an obvious question, and sometimes we can have very elaborate and very personal answers, but in the case of The Job, I have to admit that the glib answer would be masochism. Because who in their right mind would take on a subject so sweeping and so contentious as work? A subject about which almost everyone has their own opinions, and about which so many of us have our own facts. So the truth is, I tried very hard to avoid writing this book. But after a while, after some time, I knew it was unavoidable, because work was driving me and just about everyone I knew crazy. My friends, my colleagues, my students. Work was changing and fast, and it seemed that everyone was talking about it, but not many people were doing much about it. So, ever the optimist, I kind of threw myself into the fray. But first, to test the waters on this topic, I wrote a little essay about work and its meaning for a publication called The Atlantic, with which I'm associated. That essay brought a storm of response, a tsunami of response, probably the most response I've ever gotten to anything I've ever written. That didn't surprise me, though, because, work seemed to be on just about everybody's mind at the time. But what did surprise me was how many of the comments came from people just starting out in the workforce. Now, a lot of these people had worked really, really hard to get where they had gotten, and many of them were very successful by conventional standards. They had solid jobs, made good salaries. I'm sure their parents were very proud of them. And yet, from their comments, they seemed to be very, very unhappy and very, very confused. So let me read to you, rather than going into any detail, let me just read you one comment I received from a recent college graduate. She was just out of NYU. And this is what she said: "I strongly believe my generation has been trained to value only the time we spend in activities they're investments in our future. The pursuit of personal interests is not valued as an investment, and so we seek to make work our personal interest. We try to make work fit the mold of a passion, or our passions fit the mold of our work. But if work is to give purpose to an individual, he must depend on another for his purpose. His identity is thus at the mercy of another human being, and I find that terrifying. Okay, that's a quote. So it's hard to imagine that comment coming from a 22-year-old, but it did. And it stunned me. I found it chilling that someone so young could take such an ominous view of her place in the universe. And most of the other comments were variations on that theme. So I came to think of this dysfunctional relationship with jobs as our national work disorder. And I was really worried that this uneasiness with work, this discomfort with work and its future would lead to trouble. And of course it did. So I began this book at the height of the Obama administration, and I finished it last summer. And over that time, what I feared would come to pass clearly did come to pass, and that is that the nation's growing anxiety over jobs would help pave the way for the social upheaval and decisiveness we're experiencing today. So I'm sure many of you have your own views on this, and I really look forward to having you share them a bit later. But meanwhile, back to the book. So a few years ago, I was invited to a gathering of scholars who are dedicated to the understanding of work and its meaning in our lives. And what's interesting is the number of people, social scientists, management scientists, psychologists, who are engaged in this effort is growing every year. So whereas maybe 10 years ago it was a small group, now this group is really quite large. And the gathering that I attended, they had to cut off attendance quite early on because so many scholars wanted to attend. And these scholars have studied workers of just about every sort. So at this particular meeting, they were talking about ballet dancers, TSA baggage screeners, hospital cleaners, firemen, real estate agents, librarians, bankers, stockbrokers, just about every profession you can imagine. And listening to these scholars, I found their insights just fascinating. For example, what I learned there was it's not so much the type of job you have, but how you approach that job that determines whether you can make meaning of it. And I'm using that phrase, make meaning, quite deliberately, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So in this example, for example, a hospital cleaner might think of his or her job as a vocation, while a physician might think of his or her job as just a job. Okay, that's a little counterintuitive, but it is the case, and both cases are fine. How you think of your job, whether it's vocation or just a job, really depends on you, not necessarily the job itself. I also learned that many of us don't prioritize challenge in the workplace. Now, to many of you who are probably, this is being South by Southwest, you're probably mostly type A, go-go types, okay? And certainly the Silicon Valley, the Wall Street model is go-go, everyone needs challenge, everyone wants challenge. But actually, many people do not seek challenge on the job. Some people seek kinship, relationships on the job, that's what they prioritize. Some people seek mastery of the job. They want to do a really good job every single day. That's how they make meaning of their work. They don't necessarily want challenge. They don't necessarily want novelty. They don't necessarily want to move fast and break things, okay? So that's another insight that these folks offered to me. And I also learned about the growing workplace surveilling culture and how surveillance on the workplace has undermined people's ability to actually make purpose of their work. So these are things I discuss in the book, among others. I do 4 chapters on the psychology of work. But just to let you know, after hearing these and other insights from experts, I set off to see for myself what was happening on the ground. You know, whatever experts say is fine, but I really wanted to see what was going on in real life. So I traveled the country, and for example, in Kentucky, I had morning coffee with a young guy, a college graduate, who actually handcrafts brooms for a living, brooms, okay, and sells them on the internet and makes a living doing that. So I had coffee with him in the morning, and that evening I had also coffee in the kitchen of a glass plant worker, a guy who spent his entire life working in a glass plant, who feared nothing more than unions. It's very interesting to hear why he feared unions, okay? In Portland, Maine, I spoke with a textile designer and draper who makes props for Hollywood blockbusters and for television shows like Man Men out of her home in Portland, almost never sets foot in LA. And I found out from her why unions were so important to her membership in the union. In Manhattan, I spoke with the owners of one of the nation's last remaining button-making factories and how he was able to keep in business despite the Chinese competition and what he called the Chinese threat. I hung out at co-working spaces in Minneapolis and worker-owned cooperatives in Cleveland. And I spent nearly a week in Detroit to witness that city's efforts to redesign work for the Rust Belt, and a week in Helsinki in Finland, talking to Finns about their nation's, quote, reconsideration of work initiative. The Finnish government was responding to people's discontent with work in that country by having a year-long study of work and why they were facing these difficulties. So along the way, I learned a lot of surprising things, okay? So for example, did you know that roughly 100 firefighters a year are convicted of arson? They're called sparkies, okay? Did you know that real estate agents are on average more satisfied with their jobs, not just than lawyers, which you would expect, but also they're more satisfied with their jobs than physicians or scientists? We talk about that. Did you know that each year in Finland, there's the International Wife Carrying Championships? You can watch it on YouTube. Okay, so that was just something that has nothing to do with work, but I found that quite astonishing. So I was thrilled to come across so much of this quirky, unexpected stuff. But what I also discovered was a disconnect between official claims about work and what was actually happening on the ground day to day. I learned that a lot of what we're told about work and a lot of what we've come to think about work does not comport with this reality. So bear with me just for a minute while I pull back with some of this wonky stuff that we have to get through. So late last year, I think we all know that the official unemployment rate reached its lowest point in 50 years. That is 3.7%, very low. It's now about 4%, but still, that's what economists call full employment, okay? So I don't dispute the statistic, it's a fact. But what I do dispute is what it has come to signify. For example, the US government reports that there are currently nearly 7 million job vacancies, including 2 million manufacturing job vacancies. And some analysts point to that statistic to warn of a looming labor shortage, a shortage that we are told is only going to get worse, some say rising to over 10 million in the next few years. And this, of course, makes many of us nervous. I mean, who's going to fill these jobs, right? We're all worried about that. But stand back a minute. Let's recognize that reports of labor shortages are not new. For years, folks like Tim Cook at Apple, Bill Gates at Microsoft, and a ton of other business leaders and their lobbyists have griped that they couldn't find enough US citizens qualified to work in their industries. So from Maine to Florida, California to Delaware, employers insisted that they were leaving money on the table for lack of qualified employees. So it comes as no surprise that politicians rallied in their defense, right? But they did so in a way, not in the way you may think they would. They did not point out the basic free market principle. Basic, any of you take Econ 101? Show of hands. Yes, great, okay. And those of you who didn't take Econ 101, I bet you've thought of this yourselves. The basic principle that a higher price for labor leads to a larger quantity supplied, and a lower price leads to a lower quantity. Okay? So for those of you who didn't take Econ 101, let me give you an example in my own life that you probably have had in your life. So when my kids were young, a long time ago, my husband and I used to like to go out on Saturday night to the movies and to dinner, right? Because we needed to. We really needed to. And in the community that we lived in, there were tons of teenagers, tons of adolescents, any one of whom we would be delighted to have babysit our kid. Anyone who was not a serial killer, we would take, okay? Our standards were not that high. But we had a hard time finding adolescents or anyone really to babysit our kids on Saturday night, and we couldn't understand it. So one night we had dinner with some friends from the neighborhood, and they told us, I bet you know what I'm going to say. What was our reason? We weren't paying enough, okay? So the going rate for babysitters in our community, we thought was extortionary. We just thought this was crazy. But in fact, what we decided to do was instead of going out to dinner and a movie, we would just go out for a movie, and we'd pay the going rate for a babysitter. We also learned you had to throw in some Ben & Jerry's ice cream, right? There are perks that have to go along with this. And once we learned the drill, we had absolutely no problem getting babysitters, okay? So that is, for those of you who need babysitters or other things in your life, you kind of know that you have to pay a certain wage to get what you want. But rather than apply this basic, common sense babysitter metric, or even take a close look to see if this labor shortage is real, okay? Business leaders and their partners in politics blame Americans, saying that too few of us are prepared to hold a 21st century job. Now, some of these business leaders and politicians take pot shots at 20-somethings and millennials and their parents. And you've heard that, you know, millennials are lazy, they're entitled, they all have, helicopter parents, all that stuff. You've heard that. And many take aim at the nation's educational system, and they insist that our schools are unsuited to the demands of a global digital economy, and they blame this on who? Mostly the teachers, right? So it seemed to me no coincidence that the National Education Association, the largest public union in the country, comes under particular criticism. And I'll leave that to you to think about. Just as an aside, well, Americans think, that are told, or there's a meme out there that our schools are failing, most Americans are actually quite happy with their children's schools individually. So it's interesting, while we think our children's school is okay, we think educational system in the United States is falling apart, okay? But to back up, let's get one thing straight here. There is certainly a labor shortage of a sort, but not the sort of labor shortage that's generally implied. Thanks in large part to the crackdown on immigrants, there are fewer workers to build houses and do landscaping, for example. There are fewer workers to pick crops. There are fewer workers to take care of children and the elderly. But in manufacturing jobs or IT, or in fancy jobs that require, say, a law degree or an MBA or a PhD, not so much, okay? So from what I witnessed on the ground, and from the economists I spoke with and the statistics I've looked at, claims of a skills gap are really at odds with reality. there's no question that some businesses have trouble finding some filling some specialized positions. But overall, the job market remains tilted in the employer's favor. So this, of course, explains this mystery, this oddly sluggish wage growth we have in the United States. Why hasn't wage growth proceeded at a pace? It's slowly creeping up, very, very slowly, but it certainly hasn't made up for the financial meltdown in 2008. It's moving at a glacial pace. If we had a tremendous skill shortage, labor shortage, it would be moving much more quickly. So as one labor attorney told me, so as a consequence of this, many of us feel we have much less leverage to negotiate the terms of our job than we would like to have. And that's reality, that is true. As one labor attorney told me, workers think they have rights, but in truth, forgive the language, this is what he said, they really don't have shit, okay? So the labor shortage and skills gaps are myths that I explore I challenge in the book, and there are others. For example, what I call the passion paradox, that is the imperative that we feel passionate about our jobs. Now, social scientists who actually study this stuff have found that the more passionate we feel about our jobs, the more likely our jobs are to take advantage of us, and our employers are. Okay, so one of the examples I use, because it's been so deeply studied by social scientists, is going to surprise you, are zookeepers. Okay? I actually gave a talk in Washington, and there was a zookeeper in the audience. Is there a zookeeper in the audience today? Please? No? Okay. I don't know if is there a big zoo in Austin? I don't know. Okay, anyway, so zookeepers feel passionate about their work, on average, okay? Many zookeepers start off in the field working for free as adults. Most actually have college degrees. They've loved animals since they were children. They have pets, and they feel a complete dedication to their field. And partially as a consequence of this, there are more people who want to be zookeepers than there are positions for zookeepers. And partially as a consequence of that, the pay for zookeepers is very low. And their status, unfortunately, is very low. So I was speaking to one zookeeper about this, and he told me a story. I said, give me an example. What do you mean your status is low? And he said, one time I was working in a cage with one of the animals, and a school group came, and the teacher brought the kids up to the cage that I was working in, and she pointed her finger at me, and she said, kids, you better study hard, or you're going to end up like him. So despite this, he mustered on, low pay, very little opportunity for advancement, because he felt so passionate about his job. Now, one might want to rethink this and think you may feel passionate about working with animals, but you may want to think your passion for this particular job. Another myth or misconception I tackle in the book is the one of entrepreneurs as the nation's most effective job creators. Okay? No, there's no question that some entrepreneurs build businesses that result in some jobs, but to say that most do is pure fantasy. Over the long term, most entrepreneurs employ few, if any, people other than themselves and their members of their own family. We're talking about the majority of entrepreneurs. Doesn't mean there aren't exceptions, there are many exceptions. But the fact is that long-established legacy firms create the lion's share of jobs in the private sector. You have to keep in mind that Walmart is the nation's largest employer. That's a very old-school legacy firm. And Amazon, which is now hovering at number 2, okay, is actually just about a legacy firm at this point. It's almost 25 years old, okay? So when we think of startups, startups are great, but in terms of job creation, we might want to think more about investing in legacy firms, which because they're larger, they employ more people, and they have more latitude they can actually be just as innovative and, in fact, more innovative than many startup firms. So related to this, we've all heard a lot about taking psychological ownership of our jobs. Well, if that means taking responsibility, working hard, that's great. But increasingly, employers want us to invest in our jobs the way an entrepreneur might invest in his or her company. That is, to take an emotional stake in our jobs. But given that most of us serve at the pleasure of our employer, the larger the emotional stake we take in our job, the more likely we are to be owned by our job. And in the book, I visit several workplaces where this is in play. People are entrepreneurial. They're expected to be entrepreneurial, and they've taken a great emotional stake in it. And I can tell you the consequences are not too pretty. So the bottom line is here. Our employers cannot gift us with meaning or with a sense of purpose or a reason for being. These are gifts that we can only give to ourselves. And making meaning from work is very much a do-it-yourself proposition, okay? So how do we go about making meaning from our work in a time of turbulent change? A time when there is no certainty that any particular job will even exist in coming decades. Well, I'm afraid you're going to have to read the book to find all that out, and you can take it out of the library. I'm not shilling for it. But I do go into great depths in that, on that topic, and we can talk about it a little bit in the Q&A. But in the prologue, I open with a hint. The prologue of the book is about a town, Marienthal, Austria. Have any of you heard of Marienthal, Austria, or been there? Okay? It's a small town, and I start there in the 1920s. Now, that seems kind of odd. You're talking about a book on the future of work. Why are you starting in Marienthal, Austria in the 1920s? Well, I do because what happened in that tiny village nearly a century ago forced the world to recognize what we know today. That is, that work in all its richness, complexity, and joy is essential for people to flourish. But the story also illustrates that a job is only a subset of work and not necessarily the most critical one. So I'd like to read just a little bit, I am an author, just a little bit of the prologue, 2 minutes, and then I really want to hear what your thoughts are on this subject. So forgive me while I read a little bit. Okay. Are you guys up for this? Yeah. Okay. I don't know, this is not my usual venue, so, you know, students have to listen to you. Not really, they don't actually. They have to pretend that they're listening to you. Okay. So this chapter is called The Unbroken, the prologue. So 200 years or so ago, the tiny community of Marienthal, Austria, emerged shanty by shanty on the muddy banks of the Fischer River, 15 miles southeast of Vienna. The thin soil made farming dicey, but the river flowed briskly and almost never froze, gushing a steady source of hydropower. The Industrial Revolution roused the hamlet's sleepy economy, and the struggling farmers abandoned their cabbage and potato fields for a new life in the factory. So the factory was called the Imperial Marienthal Cotton Spinning Mill and Woolens Manufacturing Company, and it hummed day and night. Men and women and children perched shoulder to shoulder on long benches, making blue and pink cotton prints for export to Hungary and the Balkans. The pay was low and the job demanding, but the work was steady and sure, and there were no worries about foul weather or pests as there had been on the farm. And the good people of Marienthal were grateful for the opportunities that progress had brought them. But the Great Depression smothered the Austrian economy. Currency inflated dramatically, the banks collapsed, and consumer demand shriveled. In the summer of 1929, the factory began its steady decline. The spinning mill, the printing works, and the bleaching plant were all demolished by heavily muscled men wedging sledgehammers. And you can still see the pictures of this. It's very depressing. The great looms were dismantled and sold off. More than 1,200 people, that is, virtually in the entire town, lost their jobs. Come winter, the people of Marienthal were surrounded by the ruins of their former working lives. Dented boilers, broken transmission wheels, crumbling factory walls. Most of them were where they hoped they'd never be, on the dole. Deprived of their livelihood, the villagers withdrew. The once bustling library emptied. The park was abandoned and choked with weeds. Public debate cooled, social clubs disbanded, and children lost their resolve. So in Marienthal, joblessness had become a job itself, a thankless, miserable one that set citizens into revolt, not against the system, but against one another. So this is sounding a little familiar, right? People were isolated, pessimistic, bitter. They spied and they snitched on one another, especially around issues of money. They were really particularly concerned, for example, about what we know today as welfare cheats, and they would rat on each other. And there was also some other kinds of mischief. Family pets vanished from backyards and porches, the occasional cat, but mostly dogs. The title of a monograph from that period sort of tells the whole story. The title was When Men Eat Dogs. Yet, the weirdest thing going on in Marienthal at that time was not dog on dinner plates, although that was pretty weird. It was that men abandoned their sense of time. They quit wearing watches and were generally late for meals and appointments. Their pace slowed to a crawl, and asked where they had been and what they had done at the end of the day. Many of them admitted that they simply couldn't recall anything happening. So researchers who came down from Vienna, social scientists who came down to look at this, were stunned by what they saw. I mean, poverty was a terrible thing, but these people were not starving. They had some insurance, they had pensions, they had their homes, they had their families, and of course they had each other. Yet rather than unite, the community was atomized, with individuals scrambling to snatch any personal advantage. Joblessness was an evil unto itself, right? Joblessness was an evil unto itself, demoralizing and killing and dangerous. So you may be thinking that Marienthal back then has very little to do with the United States today. And you may be right. Yet there's a plot twist to this tale that's entirely relevant to our times, a twist that's rarely mentioned in the retelling of this story. For while some men in Marienthal stopped wearing watches, ratted out each other, and even stole their neighbors' pets, the same could not be said for everyone, especially not the women. Losing their jobs didn't rob the women of Marienthal of their sense of agency or purpose, and it didn't lead them to passive resignation. After the factory closed, they actually slept an hour and a half less a night than did the men. They rose up early in the morning, as they had always done. They opened cottage businesses. They planted vegetable gardens. They raised rabbits. They put money away, small amounts for their children for gifts. As one mother told the researcher, although I now have much less to do than before, I am actually busy the whole day. Sounds odd, right? But though this might sound a contradiction, the researchers really understood what she meant. They wrote this: "The term unemployed applies in the strict sense only to the men, for the women are merely unpaid, not really unemployed." Again, does that sound familiar? Unpaid, not unemployed. So it goes for daughters and mothers and wives. But gender played a smaller role in this story than it might appear. So some men, too, carried on when the factory closed. They also cultivated vegetable gardens and raised rabbits, and they also spent more time with their children. They clung tenaciously to the purposeful tasks that anchored them in the world and gave structure to their days. Their work did not depend on an employer. It was indelibly part of who they were. The researchers had a name for these particular men and women. They called them the Unbroken. And as we'll see in the following chapters, if you do manage to take the book from the library, their story of survival and the throes of tumultuous change have much to inform our own time. Thank you. Okay, so I'm supposed to get these questions somehow. Some kind of technology is involved in this. But I just as soon have people raise their hands. Comments. You're kidding. Thoughts? Yes. Please begin. Can you stand up and give your name? Okay, so the question is, what do I think? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether AI, machine intelligence, is going to change the nature of work going forward and what it means. Is that roughly what you're asking? Yeah, yeah. She gets participation points. Okay. Yes.
But I didn't do the reading yet.
True. Clearly.
Yeah.
No kidding.
What I've been hearing, for example, is like, you've got candidate who many people have heard of, Andrew Yang.
Yes.
Talking about having a universal basic income.
Yes.
Subsidized by a tax on tech because
Yes.
it's not a question of is AI going to take away certain labor. It is.
Right. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Ocasio-Cortez, when she gave her keynote,
Yes.
also sort of referenced.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
True,
Okay. So that's a question I get very frequently. And let me just say that when I started this book 8 years ago, so this was a lengthy project, economists and computer scientists were quite skeptical about AI, machine learning, supplanting human effort in the long term. Okay, they were quite skeptical, and they kept referring to historical examples about how, obviously we know the Industrial Revolution, things got shaken up. We kind of forget how awful it was. Those of us who've read Dickens kind of know it wasn't the greatest time for people in manufacturing regions of the world. But nonetheless, we recovered and we rebounded, and it was fine. A lot of economists 8 years ago, 6 years ago, agreed with that, and now, but since in the recent years, there's been a 180-degree turn on that. Most computer scientists are really quite concerned about this. This is why the basic income guarantee is seems to be so broadly supported in Silicon Valley. And there are other reasons. I mean, they're quite concerned. One computer scientist I spoke with at Columbia said that he feels that this is one of the most difficult engineering problems he's ever encountered. That is, what's going to happen to us as cognitive resources, human resource involving cognition, gets siphoned off to machines. And he's really quite concerned about this. His name is Lipson at Columbia. But in any case, so I think it's inevitable. And I think that trying to hold back it's like putting our finger in the dike. It's not a good idea. Progress is inexorable. I think we have to deal with it. It's happening. It's speeding up. And I think, everything from self-driving cars to being able to make medical diagnoses, a huge variety of things, of tasks, will become more automated. Not entirely automated, but more automated. When that happens, obviously there are fewer people needed to do this particular task, right? So how do we deal with that, okay? As I gave a hint by talking about Marienthal, there's absolutely no shortage of work that needs to be done, and there's absolutely no shortage of work that people want to do. So we have to make a determination. What's the kind of work we do not want to hand to the machines, okay? What kinds of things do we enjoy doing? Now, an example I could use, I don't use in the book, but does anybody remember when being a cook was kind of not such a great job? And now those of us, at least on the coasts, know that being a chef is a very fancy job, but that's a job that could be entirely automated, right? We could all eat processed foods. When I was a kid growing up, I was a very avid skier, and I would go out and I'd do a whole day of skiing, living on something called space food sticks. Does anybody remember what a space food stick is? A couple people do. They were kind of gross, but they did the job, okay? Now, we could be living on those things, but we choose not to. In fact, we've, in a sense, regressed. We pay people large sums of money to cook for us, right? And we want to do that. And the folks who do it want to do that job. So that's a job that we can hang on to despite the fact it could be automated. But we have to also keep in mind that, these very high-skilled jobs, the biggest profit is offered by automating the highest skilled jobs. Now, to give you another example, McDonald's, fast food companies could all be using burger flipping machines. I'm sure some of you are into technology. You know those machines exist, right? They exist. But right now, the labor is cheaper than the machines and maintain those machines. So there's not a big push to automate those jobs. Where the push is in higher level jobs, okay? Where the cost is high. So a lot of the higher end research in this is involved in trying to automate higher level knowledge jobs. So we have to be aware of that. We have to take that in stride. We can't hold it back. It's very exciting research. It could have really positive outcomes, especially in areas of medicine where there's a tremendous, a tremendous error rate, and I'm optimistic that that can be improved using technology. But we need to be aware of it and decide upon which jobs we want to hold on to, which jobs are worth doing, and which jobs do we want done, okay? So that's a new conversation, and I go into it a lot in the book, but this is probably not the forum. I'd love to have your ideas. So thoughts on that from anyone else? Did that address your question? What I want policymakers to do? First, I want policymakers to be honest with the American people and not say that the way to solve this problem is for everyone to acquire more and more education, okay? I love education. I'm an educator. I work at a university. I'm a big proponent of education. But education for jobs, I think we have to rethink that. I think that is not the solution. It's not that we have an uneducated population. We have the most educated population we have in history, right? More people are going to college than ever before. More people are completing college. That's not a bad thing. That's great. But it is not as if going forward, the stopping point, the pinch point, is lack of educated population, okay? There are other things. For example, the fastest growing job category in America, you're not going to like to hear this, is personal health care aid. That does not now require a college education. We can have a conversation about whether it should or not. I certainly think it should be certified. I think it should be elevated. I think it can provide millions of jobs. It's something that we really need and really want. And by the way, it's something that it's a kind of work that a lot of people really want to do. They love the work, they find it rewarding, and yet it's so poorly paid. It pays on average something between $22,000 and $24,000 a year. So it does not pay a living wage, and by my standards, okay? So we might want to rethink that because it's a job we need to get done. It's a job that people want to do. So maybe we need to rethink how we can compensate that and elevate that. One suggestion would be, for example, as I said, to certify it, and therefore, once it was certified, it would be higher paying. And it would also save us money in the long run because it's very well known that well-trained personal health care aides save in the overall health care bill, right? So there are things like that, but there's any kind of global recommendation would probably not be honest. It's almost a job-by-job recommendation. Yes. Sorry.
Sorry, I have a question at the mic.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you
there?
for your presentation today.
I see, yeah.
The millennial generation is being called the burnout generation. So I was wondering if you have recommendations for what individuals can do to establish better work-life balance and what you think employers should be doing at scale to create a society of unbrokens.
Thank you for that question. Could you all hear that? That millennials are called the burnout generation. So while researching the book, what I found out was, especially listening to those responses to the Atlantic essay, which was mostly millennials, by the way, what they were saying is, because they weren't feeling passionate about their jobs, because they weren't feeling a sense of purpose about their jobs, they felt that they had to work harder. They would come to them that they weren't applying themselves hard enough, and so they'd have to work harder. And I think to some degree that explains this burnout phenomenon among millennials. Now, we all know, right? The millennial population generation is the largest sector of the workforce right now. They've blown out the boomers, okay? So that's the largest segment. So it's really important that we think about how they can achieve, a work-life balance, as you put it, although that term is considered antiquated. The work-life balance is considered antiquated because people feel that work should seamlessly integrate into people's lives. Now, I mentioned to you that in the course of doing this book, I spent some time in Finland. And I spent some time in Finland both to look at the educational system, but also to look at their initiative, their work initiative. And one of the places I went to in Finland was in the north, and it was a sausage factory. Okay, why did I go to this sausage factory? It was called Snellman's. Has anybody ever heard of it? Is anybody from Finland? You have! Is it good sausage?
Pretty nice.
Pretty good, yeah. That's what I never tasted, but it's supposed to be good. Okay, so I spoke to a guy who worked at Snell's. Why did I go to this company? This was one of the happiest companies in Finland. And the Finnish government was actually studying this company. Why were people so happy making sausage? You know what? Okay, so the guy I talked to actually had a college degree. He had a degree in philosophy. And he was not working in marketing. He was not working in sales. He was actually making sausage. So I said, why do you like this company so much? And he goes, this company's great. First of all, this product is really good. This is really good sausage. Okay, I had to take his word for it. I don't know from sausage. Okay. So that's one thing. The other thing is, they really insist that we leave at 5 o'clock and go home to our families. They insist on it. And if we want to have any recreational activities, because there's a gym at this place, and you could take a law course at this place, you could take foreign language classes in this place, but you do it during the workday. So he would go out and work during his lunch hour, he'd go to the gym and work out, but at 5 o'clock every day, he got on his bicycle and he went home to his family, okay? So this whole idea in the United States that work needs to seamlessly integrate into your weekends, into your evenings, into every facet of your life. We all know for a fact that does not increase, you guys know this, it does not increase worker productivity. It puts enormous stress on the workforce. But it is part of our culture, it's part of our status. Working long hours has become part of our status. We feel valued, we are needed in the office. So as individuals, and I do think millennials are working on this and are questioning this because they've seen their parents burn out, okay? And I think millennials are starting to push back on this. I actually, in the book, I'm quite optimistic about this. I think that millennials are getting things more in balance than their parents, okay? So I hope that's helpful. Yes. Yes.
So I've got a follow-on question from that.
Yeah.
So I work with students to help provide practical learning opportunities. Do you think that a student would be more affected by changes in the workforce, someone who's potentially finishing I'm from Australia, so we call it high school education, and entering university? Or do you think someone, and they haven't experienced work before, or someone who's, say, Gen X in mid-40s and 50s, and they're used to a particular kind of work? So is it going to affect automation? Is automation going to affect people that haven't yet experienced it, or people that are used to a particular type of work more?
I'm having a little difficulty understanding your question. Are you saying is job training great for older people, or just for younger people? I'm not quite sure what your question is. I'm sorry.
So I guess my question is, who would be more affected by automation and artificial intelligence?
Yeah.
A student who hasn't yet experienced work?
Yeah.
Or someone who's experienced work for a long period of time?
More affected by artificial intelligence. Well, I think many people, especially in mid-level jobs, have found their work situation change dramatically or go away because of automation. And so, for example, you know, in the book I go to Detroit in Ohio, and I visited a community college where mid-career or older workers were being retrained in advanced manufacturing, okay? Advanced manufacturing techniques. This is Sinclair Community College, is a wonderful place. It's one of the largest community colleges in the United States. They're very dedicated to training the workforce. Now, unfortunately, when I went there, I didn't know what to expect. It was really interesting, wonderful people. I really, really loved the people at this place. However, the problem was this. So you had, mostly men who'd worked on the assembly line at General Motors. They had a big GM plant just outside of Dayton, Ohio, where this was. And they were retraining in advanced manufacturing because the idea is, well, there's so much opportunity in advanced manufacturing and they need skills. So they spent 2 years in this program, and I actually I attended the graduation project that they were working on. They were all finishing up this project. And I interviewed the people who were finishing this project. Only 2 had positions, had jobs, and these jobs were paying them $10 an hour. Okay? So these were folks who had been working for General Motors, making $40 an hour before. They'd gone through a 2-year program. The opportunities were much more scarce than they'd been led to believe. So job training programs for specific industries, I worry about. Okay? I really do. Lots of times these are publicly supported programs for private industry. I feel that if industry has such a lack of skilled workers, that they should invest more in training of their own workers, okay? I do believe education obviously is vital. I believe a good liberal arts education for every American is absolutely essential. I think specific skills training is not something necessarily that schools should be charged with, okay? So when you're talking about young people, I advise my students and my own children and every young person I talk to arm yourself with the best possible liberal arts education you can get, okay? There's a little bit of a myth that if you have so-called STEM skills, you're golden. That's not necessarily true. Obviously, if you graduate with a great computer science degree from Stanford or MIT, you're all set. No question about that. But it's not the case that every STEM, every science and math major is going to necessarily launch you into a great job. That's something else we have to reconsider. But a good liberal arts education where you've learned a variety of things, you're a good communicator, you have what one psychologist calls great analytic skills. That is, you know what problems should be solved rather than how to solve the problems. I think that's great advice for young people coming up. Okay, yeah? I think I have another, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that there's an incredible amount of pressure, I think, for our jobs to be our full passion, right?
Right.
But I think that it's rare or not all that common that our true passions or interests align with the way that we make money today. So do you see a path forward to create a world where there is more alignment with people's true passions and interests and pleasures and what we do for work and making money?
You know, listen, I don't think employers need to make their jobs fun, okay? I don't think that should be what an employer has to do. You know, I think that, I think we make the fun of our jobs. What employers should do is allow us to make meaning and enjoyment from our jobs as best we can as individuals. And one of the examples I use in the book is that of hospital cleaners, okay? So there's a big study of hospital cleaners. And hospital cleaners who are allowed to give care to the people in the hospital, that is, to kind of check, just take a look at the heart rate monitor, sit down and talk to them, felt a much stronger sense of purpose in their work than hospital cleaners who are not allowed to do that. In fact, the employers discouraged them from doing that and started penalizing them for doing that. So what employers can do is they can undermine your ability to make purpose and find meaning and find passion in your work by, for example, surveilling you. Okay, looking over your shoulder. You know, one of the things I discuss is open offices. What is the reason for open offices? A lot of that is surveillance, okay? Sometimes it works well, but sometimes it doesn't, right? So there are many things that an employer can do to undermine your efforts to make purpose of your work, and so I feel employers need to get out of the way, help people make purpose in their own way as individuals. By the way, not everyone is a team leader, right? Not everyone is you know, as I said, not everyone wants to move fast and break things. We all have our own styles, and what employers really should think about doing is how can I enable the person to exercise their own style of making meaning of their own work, okay? Yeah. I've got these, does anybody want to, okay, that's not a great question. How do we solve for gender and cultural diversity? Why don't we get the basics right first before AI and the robots take over and build on our own poor biases? Well, that's true. So AI, as you know, is trained on data sets that reflect a bias. I'm not a computer scientist, but I think we can all see the limits of that. I think that we're definitely making progress in gender and cultural diversity in the workplace, but one of the things I point out, especially in very high-level jobs, we tend to hire ourselves, right? We tend to hire people like ourselves. And there's been a lot of studies on this, so it makes it harder for us to diversify the workplace. So again, long story, in the book I talk about how we can avoid making this mistake. Because if you don't have a diversified workplace, you know, it obviously is not only bad for the employees, but it's bad for business, right? You need to have a range of people, get a range of opinions in your workplace, but the way hiring is done at this point tends to favor people hiring people like them, okay? So that's not great, and I think we're moving around away from that. I think people are getting aware of that. There are all sorts of strategies how this is happening. In the book, I compare Israel and the United States and how they hire. Israel is kind of tends toward hiring people based on a skill set and abilities. In the United States, we tend to hire for cultural fit and chemistry. That's probably not the best idea, okay? Is there anyone else that would like to ask a question? I have these questions, but I like real human beings. Okay, well, thank you for coming, and have fun at the festival. I know I will. Take care.